The next speaker is Antonio Padoa Schioppa from Milan, Accademia delle Scienze, and the title of his intervention is Academies, Interdisciplinary Europe. Would you like to sit here? Okay, see you. Wait.
Let me say at the beginning that the two speeches that we have heard have put essential points and a framework of ideas that I say totally share. My task will be more simple and, if I can say, more modest, to see in this general context that I think is essential for this Congress, to try to express some specific activities that the academies should perform in a complementary way for other cultural institutions, beginning, of course, from the universities. The historical sketch that Professor Lopreno has, I'm a legal historian, has expressed is very important, because the relationship between academia and university is a complex relationship and has varied much in history. I also apologize for reading and not speaking. You will excuse me, I'll do so. A re-examination on the function of the academies in the present time is to welcome for several reasons. First, the situation of culture and the relationship between all scientific disciplines and reality in the world's current historical phase of profound transformation makes such a re-examination not only well-timed but also necessary. Second, the academies can and must play an important role in the future, and this role must be complementary with respect to other cultural institutions. Third, in such a context, networks among academies in a European perspective offers new opportunities and stimuli. The theme is not new. In recent years, some initiatives to valorize the role of the academies have been held in France and in Italy, by example, by the Institut de France and by the Accademia dei Lincei. The unprecedented development of scientific research constitutes one of the most important characteristics of the present era, not only in the countries of Europe and in the United States of America, but in every part of the planet, from China to India and Russia, from Australia to South America, and even Africa. University and research institutes are producing an impressive amount of contributions in print and online, and that amount is increasing exponentially, especially in the sciences, biology, medicine, physics, chemistry, natural sciences, computer science, and so on. Equally impressive is the outstanding development of new technologies, strictly interconnected with the scientific theories and discoveries. In the humanities, too, a similar increase of researches is taking place from prehistory, history, law, economy, sociology, archaeology, philosophy, philology, and more. To recall just one example, each year in the field of medieval history studies produces over 8,000 contributions in print every year. In the natural sciences, the rhythm of research is so fast-paced that articles are considered obsolete only 5 years after publication. The need to update is so absorbing as to demand an enormous amount of time and energy from every researcher, whereas for other disciplines, the supervening research engage scholars full-time in their chosen fields, which are of necessity narrow so that they can be kept under control, and therefore original results can only take place in a circumscribed field. These elements are well known and have led to increasing specialization. Scientific careers, both in and outside the university, limit this horizon because this is the only way for scholars to have opportunities to gain credit and credits in their institutions. How can the role of the academies be conceived in this context, which certainly produces not only a wealth of outstanding results, but also limits imposed by its hyper-specialized nature? A first profile worthy of attention is one which suggests that the academies promote research initiative in the direction of interdisciplinarity. Others have already called attention to this aspect. However, the theme still deserves to be investigated. In the past, such crossings were certainly not lacking. It is worth recalling that an essential spark for the theory of evolution came to Charles Darwin from his reflections upon Malthus' theory of populations. Today, in medicine, biotechnologies are fundamental. In astronomy and cosmology, particle physics is basic. In business law, the economic dimension is indispensable. In archaeology, both physics of carbonium decay and genetics are essential tools. There are countless other examples. However, the structure of university is generally not well adapted to promote these connections. Departments are limited according to the fields of specific disciplines or groups of disciplines. Here where the academies could effectively step in with complementary functions. Each academy is composed of a selection of scholars with different scientific backgrounds. Academies are interdisciplinary for their very nature, and that is why concrete activities could be brought out in this direction. This is true not only for the mutual relationship between the so-called hard sciences, but also for the cutting relations between what we call the two cultures, mathematics and law, literature and sociology, paleontology and prehistory, genetics and historical population dynamics have already cut across the boundaries of their research fields with extraordinary results. However, much has yet to be performed in other sectors of knowledge. The interface with big data procedure, computer science, and artificial intelligence is often just as indispensable. A second cultural domain that deserves to be focused by the academies is, in my opinion, the task of divulging scientific knowledge. Today, all high-level periodical publications and also many daily newspapers have introduced a section on science and technology. There are also numerous high-quality volumes published for the general public by internationally famous authors, beginning with winners of the Nobel Prize and of other distinguished awards. However, it must be stressed that not all of these volumes keep their promises, because writing to explain scientific approaches and results in a way that is both correct and comprehensible is a difficult task, very difficult task. Not all scientists, even of a high standard, are able to do so, even if excellent examples abound. The need of high-ranked scientific divulgation is real on two fronts. On the one hand, basic scientific culture must be increased as a part of the school and of the permanent education of every individual. On the other, specialized researchers themselves also need to know about research developments in the fields that are often very distant from their own. Here too, besides the interdisciplinary cooperation mentioned above, that is for research, the divulgation role is essential, as specialized training is not possible across such distant fields of human knowledge. In this perspective, the task of spreading knowledge of research is a field that the academies seem particularly qualified to carry out, with others, of course, not exclusively, of course, to carry out also with regard to the high schools, as some recent initiatives have shown. A third task deserving attention is the field of the research projects and editions of historical and archaeological sources, which require different approaches and dynamics than those that are normal in a typical university research setting, where the basic task for researchers is to write original scientific articles. Yet, without the difficult and tiresome work of editing unprinted sources, both ancient and modern, the progress in scientific work is itself often impossible. Let's mention such extraordinary results as those produced in the past by non-university cultural institutions, like the imposing Monumenta Germaniae Historica, or here in Piedmont, the Monumenta Historiae Patriae, or the great campaigns of archaeological research, or the national editions of important authors, even in the mathematical or medicine history, which have in recent times so often remained at a standstill due to the lack of funds, and for the university career reason that I just mentioned. On these fronts, too, the academies could play a prominent role if they could get the resources, of course, for financing initiatives and paying some young scholars who will otherwise endorse, as actually happens, monographic studies, the only ones actually useful for a university career. If more accent is placed on the functions of the academies as promoters of researches and initiatives as those mentioned above, it will be convenient and even necessary to think of flanking, in my opinion, the Academy's present members with newly nominated younger members who are at the height of their career prospects. We should not forget that in the past, for example in France, but not only in France, also some very young scholars and writers were made members of the academies. Achieving this aim could eventually require rewriting their status by designating a quota of vacant places for scholars, for example, who are in their 30s or 40s, or by possibly stipulating that members who are over 80, that's a possibility, of course, be designated as emeriti, always members, but emeriti, so as to reserve the places left vacant for younger scholars. Solidly grounded activities that the academies should usefully be called upon to engage in go beyond those that have just been mentioned. Others could be added as a fourth basic task. They concern decisions made in the public sphere and in the world of policy making in general. In today's world, the extension that the range of parliamentary and government competencies has taken on has led to an unprecedented power of the political class in almost every field of the community life, from economics to law, from education to scientific research, from health to environment. All of this and much more falls in many cases and domains under the control of the political class. This is justified on the basis of the principle of popular sovereignty that underlies representative democracies. Nevertheless, this trend is not without serious risks, given the temporal horizon to which the political classes usually direct their decisions with an eye constantly looking the upcoming elections, even the local ones. We know that. A second risk, not less dangerous for the present and future social and political asset, lies in the superpower of the great supranational corporations, including those working on the digital world that we all know. Other risks can be added, like the constant orientation of the political class toward a direct and indirect control of television networks and social media due to the incessant encroachment of the internet, not only a bearer of an immense volume of information accessible by each and every citizen for the first time in history, but also at the same time the source of devious manipulations of the available information, thus menacing the very core of the democratic institutions. If here a political democratic control is required, also important, even essential, is the function of informing the public opinion to be carried out by independent institutions. Independent. What I suggest is that the academies could play a significant role in this context, composed as they are of individuals who have been chosen because of their scientific and cultural prestige through a procedure of cooptation and, at least in principle, but for the most part also in practice, without political or ideological basis. This role could assume various concrete forms, each of them deserving attention. The first can be summed up in Einaudis "know in order to decide," conoscere per deliberare. I certainly do not deny that impartial initiative and authorities are already underway in the fields of natural and social sciences, by the investigation promoted by political organizations too, parliaments and governments themselves, not to mention, but they are fundamental, the work of international organizations like the United Nations, UNESCO, and many non-government organizations. Nevertheless, space for further information on themes like the environment, representative democracies, inequalities, natural disasters, hunger and thirst in the world, bioethics, rising nationalism, migratory phenomena, demographics, alternative forms of energy, and much more certainly exists. And in this domain, studies and reports by academies would bring significant contributions. The ascertainment of facts should be combined with the indication of possible concrete choices on each issue. If here a certain amount of skepticism is well grounded, as the politicians abhor generally delegating choices, yet sometimes it could even be advantageous for them to stick to the result of serious and far-looking reports, as in the past happened many times. It is sufficient to recall the Poor Law in England, the railway network in the 19th century, the Beveridge Plan, but also the Coal and Steel Community Plan, the Common Market, and the euro itself, besides many others. Each of these fundamental reforms was born as a follow-up of a far-sighted, independent researches and proposals. A further possible task, eventually to be conferred to academies, should be the selection of potential candidates summoned to cover some independent agencies. On this front, they could play a role, with the due dose of skepticism, as I have already said. But the function should be important in many cases. A last profile to which I wish to call attention regards the relationship between the different academies and their function on a European and international scale. Already, Giuliano Amato has said perfectly exact things that I share on this domain. In the past, the great academies have always promoted and valorized exchanges among scholars from the different countries of Europe. Just think, for example, of the fruitful contacts that the Royal Society of London promoted in 17th and 18th centuries among English scholars and mathematicians, physicists, biologists, and naturalists from France, Holland, Germany, Italy, and elsewhere. The same is also true for the academies united under the aegis of the Institut de France, for the Prussian Academy founded by Leibniz in Berlin at the beginning of the 18th century, and for other academies. This European and international dimension is still necessary today, even more necessary. The following brief summary will outline some of the research's paths that could be undertaken in coordinated initiative among academies of different countries. It is well known that the history of the different countries in Europe, as written by historians and as taught in the schools, was and still is often distorted because the viewpoint of the historians was delimited by their national framework. Giuliana Amato has just called our attention on this. Several attempts have been made to write national histories not vitiated by such distortion. However, a great deal still remains to be done. Research work and, above all, proper divulgation could be undertaken by the academies mainly through bilateral and multilateral relations. Another field deserving attention aims to identify the characteristics of the European civilization, the identity, the European identity that is also has been mentioned, from the Middle Age to the modern age, that are original and specific when compared to other great civilizations. There are specific aspects of each country, but also an interplay, continuous interplay between and among countries, but there is some features that are common or become common to the whole European development in history. And some are specific. I just mentioned, I've dealt with that, the principle of separation between temporal and spiritual spheres. That is a typical feature of, in my opinion, of the European culture. Here too, a wealth of research has certainly been carried out, but only gradually is headway being made as regards the conviction that these original characteristics not only exist, but have taken on concrete form through a dense relationship of intra-European exchange. In this regard, the academies of the various European countries can also offer valuable opportunities for comparative investigation and synthesis. A vast field, that is the last point, deserving consideration, concern the Europe's exchanges with non-European cultures and the study of the deep influences that the European culture experienced from them. It would, for example, be highly valuable to promote scholarly and also personal relationships between European academies and those of the Islamic world, as the knowledge of the fascinating history of the deep mutual influences between European and Islamic culture is still lacking or too weak outside a tight circle of specialists. The same is also true for the intercultural relationships that have taken place over the centuries between India and Europe and between China and Europe. How to perform the initiative summarily sketched above? A first condition is that inside any academy, or at least many among them, some of its members agree, with the president's consent, of course, to work for starting or pursue with their personal and direct involvement some, even at least only one of the paths mentioned above. A second aspect to be considered is that of the resources. as it is clear that many among these activities cannot be performed at zero cost. Of course, it will be necessary to take part in national and European calls for grants, following the norms and procedures established by each different institution. However, the interdisciplinarity approach and the possibility of setting out on routes that are different from the usual one, all that calls for different tools and for ad hoc direct interventions from both public and private sources. And that should not give a disadvantage of the basic principle of independence that Giuliano Amato has rightly put as fundamental. It should be stressed that the need to get also further financial resources has happened in different ways in the past, with members of several prestigious academies and scholars in charge for specific researches were financed by generous private donors to meet the costs of their research commitments. At present, the great cultural foundations could also contribute, and in parts they do that, in part. It is clear that for a correct achievement of such enterprises and initiatives, it will be necessary to identify and to follow suitable strategies and effective control procedures, thus avoiding the risks of mere self-referential distribution of funds. In conclusion, let me say that I do not imagine that every academy could pursue and carry on the whole wide spectrum of activities and initiatives outlined above. I rather think that each academy could select at least one or some among them in a fruitful connection with some other national, European, or even extra-European academies. Thank you.